Around the year 1162, somewhere among the endless grasslands and mountains of Mongolia, a boy named Temujin was born. Nobody watching his childhood could have known what he would eventually become. There was no palace waiting for him, no enormous kingdom to inherit, no powerful army that belonged to his family. There was only the steppe. It was a vast and unforgiving world where people depended on horses, livestock, family connections, and alliances for survival. Different tribes and clans competed for grazing lands, animals, wealth, and influence. Alliances could be created through marriage and friendship, then disappear just as quickly. Temujin's father, Yesugei, was an important warrior and leader. That gave the young boy some protection, but it did not last. According to traditional accounts, while returning from a journey, Yesugei encountered a group of Tatars. He was poisoned and eventually managed to return to his family. Soon afterward, he died. Temujin was still a child, and almost immediately, the fragile security surrounding his family disappeared. The people who had once followed his father refused to continue supporting Yesugei's widow, Holun, and her children. They abandoned them. For Temujin, it was an early and brutal lesson. Power attracted loyalty. Weakness could make that loyalty disappear. Holun was left to keep her children alive with very limited resources. The family gathered roots and wild plants. They fished. They hunted small animals. They survived through whatever the landscape could provide. There were periods when hunger became a constant part of their lives, and even inside the family, competition became dangerous. Temujin and his younger brother Kasar came into conflict with their older half-brother Bektar. Eventually, Temujin and Kasar killed him. Their mother was furious, but the incident revealed the violent environment in which Temujin was growing up. And his problems were only beginning. Members of the Taichud, a group connected to Temujin's father's former followers, eventually captured him. The young Temujin was restrained with a heavy wooden device around his neck. For someone who would later command armies across Eurasia, this was perhaps the lowest point imaginable. He was young, powerless, a prisoner, but Temujin escaped. During the night, he managed to evade his captors, and with assistance from people willing to hide him, he eventually returned to his family. Experiences like these shaped the leader he would become. Temujin had learned that noble ancestry alone could not protect him. He had also learned something else. Sometimes the people who saved your life were not powerful nobles. They were ordinary people who chose to help you. As Temujin became a young man, he returned to Borte. Their marriage strengthened his connections and gave him a family of his own. For a short time, his life seemed more stable. Then the Merkits attacked. They raided Temujin's camp and abducted Borte. Temujin did not have enough warriors to confront them alone, so he turned to alliances. One of the men he approached was Togrul, a powerful ruler who had previously been connected to Temujin's father. Another was Jamukha. Jamukha and Temujin had been close friends and sworn brothers. Together, their combined forces attacked the Merkits. Borte was recovered. For Temujin, the episode demonstrated the importance of political relationships. He could survive alone, but to become powerful, he needed people. For some time, Temujin and Jamukha remained allies, yet slowly differences appeared between them. Jamukha represented a more traditional aristocratic order of the steppe. Temujin began building something different. He increasingly rewarded men for loyalty and ability rather than simply for noble birth. A skilled warrior from an insignificant family could potentially gain responsibility. People who had little opportunity under other leaders began joining Temujin. His camp grew. More families arrived. More warriors pledged loyalty. And as Temujin became stronger, his relationship with Jamukha became more dangerous. Eventually, the sworn brothers separated. Friendship became rivalry. Rivalry became war. And Temujin's rise was far from easy. He suffered defeats. Alliances changed. People betrayed one another. At several moments, his entire political future was uncertain. But Temujin repeatedly recovered. And every time he returned, his organization became stronger. He surrounded himself with capable commanders. He rewarded people who remained loyal during difficult moments. His enemies increasingly discovered that defeating Temujin once did not necessarily remove him. Over time, the balance of power across Mongolia began to change. The Tatars were defeated. The relationship between Temujin and Togrul eventually collapsed, and the powerful Karaite Confederation was overcome. Then, Temujin turned against the Naiman, another major power of the steppe. They too were defeated. Jamukha's support steadily disappeared. Eventually, Temujin's former friend and greatest rival was captured. By then, the political world of Temujin's childhood had almost completely disappeared. One rival after another had fallen. In 1206, leaders gathered at a great Kurultai. Temujin was recognized as supreme ruler. He became known by the title that would make him famous across history, Genghis Khan. But perhaps the most important part of his story was what happened next. Genghis Khan did not simply gather a large collection of tribal warriors and send them toward his enemies. He reorganized them. The military was structured using a decimal system. Small groups were combined into units of hundreds, thousands, and larger formations. This weakened some of the old tribal divisions that had repeatedly fractured steppe politics. Commanders increasingly answered to the new Mongol leadership. Discipline became essential, and Mongol mobility was extraordinary. A warrior could travel with multiple horses and change mounts during a campaign. That allowed armies to move quickly without exhausting a single horse. Mongol soldiers were also highly skilled mounted archers. They could shoot while moving rapidly and maneuver across enormous battlefields. But their success was not simply the result of excellent archery. The Mongols gathered information. Scouts operated far ahead of the main forces. Commanders studied roads, rivers, mountains, settlements, and enemy movements. Messages could travel rapidly between different parts of an army. Separate Mongol forces could operate far apart and later coordinate their movements. They also used deception. One of their most famous methods was the feigned retreat. A Mongol force could appear to flee. The enemy would pursue. Its formation would stretch. Then the Mongols could turn, attack, and surround the now disorganized pursuers. Genghis Khan had taken the military traditions of the steppe and created a highly organized war machine. Soon, it moved beyond Mongolia. One of the first major targets was Western Sia. Here, the Mongols faced a challenge that steppe warfare had not fully prepared them for. Cities had walls. A horse archer could dominate open terrain, but a horse could not simply ride through a fortified gate. The Mongols adapted. They incorporated engineers, craftsmen, and specialists from conquered and allied peoples. Instead of rejecting foreign knowledge, they used it. That ability to absorb useful skills became one of their greatest strengths. Then Genghis Khan confronted the Jin dynasty of northern China. The scale was completely different. The Jin controlled wealthy agricultural lands, enormous populations, fortified cities, and large armies. Yet Mongol forces crossed the frontier and repeatedly defeated Jin armies. They moved through northern China, isolated cities, and learned increasingly sophisticated siege techniques. In 1215, Zhongdu, located in the region of modern Beijing, fell. Consider what that represented. Temujin had once been a hungry child abandoned on the steppe. Now his armies were capturing one of the great cities of East Asia. And still, the Mongol expansion continued. To the west was another enormous power, the Khwarazmian Empire. Its territory included some of the richest cities and trade routes of Central Asia. Initially, the relationship did not have to end in war. Genghis Khan appears to have wanted commercial relations. A large caravan of merchants traveled into Khwarazmian territory. At the city of Otrar, however, the caravan was seized. The merchants were suspected of espionage. Genghis Khan then sent representatives seeking a response from the Khwarazmian ruler, Shah Muhammad II. The diplomatic crisis became worse. The result was one of the most devastating campaigns of the medieval world. In 1219, Genghis Khan invaded. And this campaign showed how much the Mongol military had evolved. Rather than simply advancing as one enormous army, Mongol forces separated. Different commanders approached through different routes. Otrar was besieged. Other forces moved elsewhere. Genghis Khan himself crossed difficult terrain and appeared from a direction his enemies did not expect. In 1220, his army reached Bukhara. The city fell. Then came Samarkand. It too was captured. The Khwarazmian political system began collapsing with extraordinary speed. Shah Muhammad II fled west. Genghis Khan sent two commanders after him, Jebe and Subutai. Their pursuit became one of the most remarkable military journeys of the era. The Shah continued fleeing toward the Caspian Sea. Once the ruler of a vast empire, he ended his life isolated and stripped of much of his former power. Muhammad II died in late 1220, but Jebe and Subutai continued. Their cavalry moved west through unfamiliar territories. They traveled through Iran and toward the Caucasus. They crossed difficult mountain landscapes. Then they emerged onto the enormous grasslands north of the Caucasus. The Mongols were now approaching Eastern Europe. They encountered different peoples and armies along the way. Eventually, a coalition of Rus's princes and Cuman forces moved against them. In 1223, the coalition pursued the Mongols across the steppe. The Mongols withdrew. The pursuit continued. As the days passed, the Allied forces became increasingly separated. Some units moved faster than others. The formations stretched across enormous distances. Then, near the Kalka River, the Mongols turned around. Jebe and Subutai attacked the fragmented coalition. The result was a major Mongol victory. But this was not yet the great invasion of Europe that would come later under Genghis Khan's successors. After their extraordinary western expedition, the surviving Mongol forces eventually moved east. Meanwhile, Genghis Khan was becoming an old man. The young prisoner who had escaped with a wooden restraint around his neck was now the ruler of an empire stretching across huge parts of Eurasia. But his wars were not finished. Western Xia remained a problem. In 1226, Genghis Khan began his final campaign. He was now in his 60s. The Mongol armies advanced through Western Xia territory. Cities were attacked. Resistance collapsed. But during the campaign, Genghis Khan's health deteriorated. Exactly how he died remains uncertain. Later sources give different stories, and separating fact from legend is difficult. What historians can say with confidence is that Genghis Khan died in August 1227, while the campaign against Western Xia was still underway. He was approximately 65 years old. Tradition says that his death was initially concealed. Military operations continued. Western Xia was ultimately destroyed as an independent state. Then came the journey home. Genghis Khan's body was returned toward Mongolia. And here, history becomes mystery. The exact location of his burial has never been conclusively identified. There is no confirmed enormous tomb. No surviving palace marks his grave. The man who had conquered cities across Eurasia disappeared somewhere into the landscape from which he had emerged. But the empire remained, and it was not finished expanding. His sons and grandsons would carry Mongol armies even farther. They would conquer the rest of northern China, and eventually all of China under later Mongol rule. They would advance through Persia. They would invade the Rus' principalities. They would reach Poland and Hungary. For a time, rulers separated by thousands of kilometers found themselves connected through the same enormous imperial system. Eventually, the Mongol Empire became the largest contiguous land empire in recorded history. Its creation came at an enormous human cost. Many campaigns involved mass killing, destruction, and forced displacement. Cities that resisted could face catastrophic consequences. States that had existed for generations disappeared. For millions of people, Mongol expansion was not a story of military brilliance, it was disaster. Yet the empire also transformed connections across Eurasia. long-distance trade benefited from the enormous territories brought under related Mongol regimes. Merchants, diplomats, religious figures, craftsmen, and travelers moved between regions that had previously seemed impossibly distant from one another. Technologies, information, and ideas traveled with them. That is why the legacy of Genghis Khan cannot be reduced to a single image. He was a conqueror responsible for campaigns of extraordinary violence. He was also the founder of a political system that changed the history of Eurasia. In Mongolia, his historical meaning is very different from the memory preserved in many of the lands his armies invaded. But perhaps the most extraordinary part of his story is still where it began. Before Genghis Khan, there was Temujin, a boy whose father died when he was young, a boy whose family was abandoned, a boy who searched for food on the steppe, who fought within his own family, who was captured, who escaped, who watched alliances appear and disappear, who learned that loyalty could matter more than birth. He gathered a few followers, then dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. He defeated rivals who once seemed far more powerful than he was. He united tribes that had fought one another for generations. And then he turned the military power of the Mongolian steppe outward. By the time Genghis Khan died in 1227, the world around him had already changed. But the greatest Mongol conquests were still to come. The empire he created would survive him, expand beyond him, and reshape the political map of Eurasia. And somewhere beneath the landscapes of Mongolia, the exact resting place of the man who began it all remains unknown. Temujin entered history as an abandoned child of the steppe. He left it as Genghis Khan, one of the most consequential conquerors the world has ever known.